Thanks, Ashley. And thank you again all so much. We are now starting our official recording of Health Equity in Practice, Part 3, how to transform field language and strategies into on-the-ground change. So as we go into this web conference, PreventConnect is a national project of Valor US, and NSVRC is a national project of the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. Both projects are sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, Valor, or PCAR. As a reminder, this is part 3 in a 5-part web conference series. Parts 4 and 5 will be happening later this month. Parts 1 and 2 happened earlier in July before the National Sexual Assault Conference. If you weren't able to attend those, I saw from a few people, these are the first web conferences that you've been to with PreventConnect. You can watch those recordings at PreventConnect.org, and I highly recommend that you do watch those recordings. One, because our speakers are amazing, and also because each session in this series is meant to build on top of the one prior. So these first 2 sessions were really built on building a base foundational knowledge, and now we're transitioning into putting that into practice. So those recordings are free, they're on YouTube, they're also at PreventConnect.org, and Ashley will be putting those links in the chat. Registration is open for part 4 of this series, so that will be happening in 7 days from now at this time, this exact time, and we will be hosting how to connect and educate around social justice issues. So this session that we're in right now is really focused on how can we bring our own knowledge and create shared language, and next week we'll be talking about how to use that as we engage communities. You can register at PreventConnect.org. We have a really great series of speakers, and that will be a panel discussion. Today, we are here to talk about language, shared language, and some of the terminology that comes along with the anti-sexual violence movement. That I don't know about anyone else, but I don't have a public health background, and that's something that I was not expecting and was a really big learning curve for me. So today with you all, we're hoping to bridge language divides between academic and public health and community-based preventionists, to build skills around how to navigate that field jargon when choosing, planning, and implementing prevention strategies, and to illustrate pathways to innovating violence prevention strategies while centering communities and perspectives most impacted. All of that with the caveat that we have an hour and a half with you all today. I wish that we could do all of the things. We can't, but we will also be sending out resources for where to dive in further. So we're going to start with something a little bit different this time. Instead of a chat question, we're going to be doing a Mentimeter word cloud. So you can either take a picture of the QR code or go to menti.com and enter that code on your screen, 39104539. I'm going to hop over to Mentimeter real quick. That code will still be up there. And you're going to answer that question. What are some of the words and terms that you have learned used to describe prevention professionally? So that's like once you started your job here, what are some of the words and terms that you've heard used to describe prevention? So join at menti.com and use the code 46073803. Okay, I see proactive, stability. Social determinants is a big one up there. Really happy to see that. That's something that we're going to be talking about a lot. Upstream primary prevention, safe relationships, social ecological model, health equity, community-based, norms change, preemptive. Yeah, there's a lot here, right? But I'm seeing some really big ones. I'm seeing primary prevention as a big one, social ecological model as a big one, health equity as a big one, 100%. This is moving around a lot. I know we have a lot of people. We won't have time to see it like blow up really big, but we will send it out later. And the point here, oh, I see SEM. Yeah, so also social ecological model, upstream, harm reduction. You know, the point here is that there are all of these terms that we use and we learn once we start our jobs to describe work that we may have always been doing or people are doing, but don't have the language around that. So I'm going to move to the next one. So let's not think about the jargon, right? So like take all of that out of there. Don't think about your job. What things help to create safe and thriving communities. Let's say you're having a conversation with your neighbor and you're talking about what you need to have a safe community. I see safety, yes, collaboration, respect, empathy, access, resources, all really good. Listening, 100%, infrastructure, accountable relationships. Yeah, absolutely. And so all of these things, these words are vastly different than the words that we saw on that first slide. They're less scientific, they're less jargony. They, in a lot of ways, mean the same things, or what we talked about on the last slide might be vehicles to find these things. But the whole point here is that whether we are in a state coalition, applying for a grant at a stakeholders meeting, or just walking down the street or in our local community, we're wanting to do the same thing. We're just using two completely different languages to describe it, which makes sense. And we'll talk about kind of why that is, but it makes it really hard for us to talk to each other, to go from one space where we're using one set of words to another where we're using completely different ones. And so this web conference is really focused on how we can find points of connection through that. So thank you for filling those out. We'll hop back into this now. So this definition of health equity is what we showed in our first web conference in this series. This is from the Prevention Institute and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Health equity means that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to attain their full health potential, and that no one is disadvantaged, excluded, or dismissed from achieving this potential. That's great. I'm super on board with health equity. I think a lot of us are. The amazing thing about health equity and about a public health approach is that we can see that violence is preventable and that we need investment from communities. What can be hard or challenging that comes along with that is that health equity in and of itself is a term that does not resonate with a lot of people. Public health as a field is a field that does not resonate with a lot of people because it's very scientific, even though in public health, we work with things that directly impact people's lives. So sometimes, at least I have found, and I'll share a tiny bit about like my experience with field language and terminology, is that, you know, we can get so swept up in trying to understand all of these words and be experts in spaces that we're in, that I have felt sometimes like I lose sight of what it actually means in practice. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Like health equity, everyone wanting and needing to attain their full health potential, that's something we can all get on board with. It's something that I feel like is pretty easy to wrap your head around, but what does it take to achieve those things? That's where we really get jargony, right? So a lot of these things we already saw in that word cloud. So you have, even at the very base, primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. When I was taking my like 40-hour volunteer class and someone said tertiary prevention, I was like, what are you talking about? When they explained what that was, of like responding to survivors and providing care, I was like, okay, that makes sense. You know, then we had the social ecological model. We saw that the social determinants of health, risk and protective factors, even things like toolkits and technical packages, and all of these things can make sense to people who have an MPH or have a lot of knowledge. But, you know, when those are written into our funding streams and into our grants, and we want to find collaborative community partnerships, it can be really challenging because, you know, I've been in this field for a few years and I still don't know what a lot of these are. And as soon as I feel like I'm an expert in some terms, I'll move into a different space and I'm like, dang it, I have to start over again at the whole beginning. And it can feel really frustrating to a lot of people. We are not going to spend time in this web conference going through all of those terms. So, you know, there are two pieces to this, and our speakers are really going to talk about this when they take the space. You know, part of that is empowering people with the knowledge of that language, because that is the language that's being used. The other part is recognizing our space as people who work in domestic and sexual violence prevention, as people who work at coalition or public health spaces and identifying places where we can take white supremacy out of that language, where we can really connect with communities. If you are feeling like you need that foundational knowledge, there are some really great resources that we want to point you to, a lot of them coming out of the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. So Ashley is putting some links in the chat right now to their prevention education bootcamp, and they have a lot of those definition stuff. PreventConnect also has an e-learning course where you can get some of that information too. And NSVRC has a guide, Moving Toward Prevention, a guide for reframing sexual violence. So if you want and need to do that work, please do that. That's not what we're going to be spending a lot of our time on today, although it is important. Okay, so I talked about this a little bit before. So let's think about a general trajectory of someone who's entering the professional prevention sphere, right? So this might not be every single person, but we're going to say really generally. I kind of built it off of mine and some colleagues of mine that I know also entered this space, right? So let's think about a person who is 18 years old and they go to their first healthy relationships presentation and they learn the language for the first time in their entire life to describe the relationships that they had and other people around them had. So I'm talking about, really base, healthy, unhealthy relationships, boundaries, sexual assault. That is like a huge aha moment for them. They're learning language to define what's happening in their life. Then they feel really excited and passionate and they get involved with their local gender justice group. This might be where they start to learn a little bit about nonprofits and about other social justice issues and about community care. And that's a learning curve in and of itself. Then they get a job at their local rape crisis center and they learn about things like SARTs and NOFOs and memorandums of understanding and the continuum of care and trauma-informed care and all of these terms that they have to stop again and sit back and think about, okay, I think I know what all of these mean, but I didn't know these words to describe them. Then maybe a year later, they move into prevention. They've cared about social justice and gender and power-based violence for years, but now they're having to stop and learn again, start all over again to learn about what prevention means, and not only what it takes to prevent violence, but what we use to describe prevention: primary, secondary, tertiary prevention, the social ecological model, community engagement and mobilization, and what that means in our professional movement, not just what it means in getting your neighbor involved. When I started my first prevention job as a grassroots organizer, I was like, this makes no sense to me. And it took me a long time to feel like I was an expert in that. As soon as they feel like they're an expert in that, maybe they take a management position. They start applying for grants. They start hearing about the Stop Sexual Violence technical package from the CDC and are asked to pick an evidence-based or evidence-informed strategy to prevent violence. And they're like, what does that even mean? Coming from a box, what does it mean to engage men and boys in a way that I'm told to do that for a grant? Aren't I just talking to these people? What does it mean to do an evaluation? What does it mean to create protective environments? They're learning new terms, describe things that they may have been doing or cared about from the very beginning. And then let's say they move into a management or a coalition level. Maybe they get their master's in public health to understand what's going around them. Maybe they become a funder. Maybe they're the ones writing those calls for funding, and so they start using words like social determinants of health and health equity, and all of a sudden using a completely different language than they did at that healthy relationships presentation. And that's not always a bad thing. I'm not saying that we can't use any of that whatsoever, but just within a few years, this person has had 6 times where they've had to stop and feel maybe a little dumb, feel like they didn't know what they were doing. And it can be hard to feel like you're an expert on organizing and preventing violence when you're constantly in a space where you feel like you're not. And then we get in this really interesting space, right? We're at the very beginning of that trajectory, not always, but that's often where the work is being done. Those are those community-based organizations. That's the mobilization. Those are the projects that are being funded. But on the other side of that trajectory, that's where the work is being defined. That's where they're writing the grants, or where we're talking about health equity, or even in this web conference space where we're really trying to understand high-level theories as they relate to prevention. I have found myself, even though I have been that person at the very beginning of the trajectory, using an entirely different language now, because I want to feel smart. I want to feel like I know what I'm talking about. I want to feel like I fit into these spaces. And it can feel really hard to be able to communicate to every single level back here. How can we make sure that we are both centered in where we are, and we're keeping up on all of the information and all of the knowledge, but we're also not leaving people out where the work is actually being done? How are we transforming all of this field language and jargon into on the ground work that resonates with people so that people come in? And if we're not mindful and we're not intentional about that, we risk losing people along the way. And that happens all the time, whether that's someone who gets burnt out and doesn't see themselves in the work and quits, or whether it's in finding collaborative community partners to apply for funding and to feel empowered to do the things, to know that they're the experts in our communities. We have to be really mindful, otherwise people drop off and we have a hard time engaging people. And then we look around and we say, well, this is the work that we want to do. Why isn't anyone joining us in this? Why, if I'm an expert in the social determinants of health, and I'm an expert in creating protective factors or protective environments, why is that not happening in my community? Why do I feel like I'm a little bit lost in both spaces? And so as preventionists, we end up being in this space where we have to speak multiple languages. We have to know multiple languages, know it well, and be able to share knowledge and share power. And I want to validate that, like, that can be really tough. Ashley, who was sharing earlier, is my supervisor. And when I started at PreventConnect, we had so many, she warned me too. We had so many conversations, and she said, you know, it took me about 2 years to feel like I understood what was happening in meetings, and it was really frustrating and it was hard for me. And I was like, yeah, I know, it's fine. Meanwhile, I was thinking, it's okay, I'm smart, I catch on fast. And then it was like, I mean, it still happens now. I'll call her after meetings and say, what did we just talk about for an hour and a half? Like, I thought that I was an expert in prevention. I've been doing prevention for a long time. I came into this job and was feeling really confident, and I don't even know what anyone just said. And for me, I spent a long time thinking I was the problem. And then I talked to a lot of colleagues who really helped to put it in perspective that, like, if you're feeling this way, imagine how people at local rape crisis centers are feeling, or imagine how those community partners are feeling. And so this web conference is really focused on how we can leverage our positions to bring people into that work and to learn from them and to really get at the root of what we share and values we share. So I am really excited to welcome our speakers coming from all across the country, each sharing how they're doing this in their own way. You're going to hear from the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence, from the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence, from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and from the New Jersey Engaging Men and Boys Project, which you'll hear from the Department for Women and Families and from the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So I'm really excited, and I will pass it off to our first speakers from the Michigan Coalition, Joseph and Amanda. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having us, Janae.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Amanda Barrett. I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Joseph Canaria. I use he, him pronouns. And so, oh, go for it, Amanda, sorry.
I was just gonna say, we are so excited to get to chat with you all today. Joseph and I hopped on a little bit early, and we're just talking about how we wish some of these conversations would have been around for our own onboarding into being able to do this work, because some of it did feel really overwhelming. And we do come from various different backgrounds of doing community-based work and then taking on some of these jobs. It is, they put so many barriers to really be able to access spaces.
Yeah, and I think what we have here on the slides are the coalition's our main core tenets, right? Like we try to operate under a survivor-centered, trauma-informed, intersectional, anti-racist principles and tenets, but even with those terms, oftentimes is in that same kind of field jargon that we're trying to move away from, right? Like these are core tenets that our organization just really kind of started to uplift only a handful of years ago, right? And it took so much time and effort to get all of the member programs and organizations across Michigan to get on board with. And sometimes you still have struggles with folks wanting to feel like, why does our work have to be intersectional and rooted in anti-racist principles, right? And I think we just want to share that I think although Amanda and I have been invited to be a part of this web conference, that we here at Michigan, we're really just starting this type of work that a lot of folks have been doing for so long, right? Like we are finally kind of getting to the point at our organization and the prevention work that's happening in the state to where we're not siloing and gatekeeping and making it so we are just in that, that the deciders of who gets to do prevention work. Right? I think we recognize as coalitions, we do play that unique role in deciding what counts as prevention. Like if it doesn't fit under a fancy state or federal grant, if it doesn't fit under something that the Stop SV technical package neatly says is prevention, does it count? And I think we're finally, as an organization, starting to realize that prevention work has been happening on the ground in ways in which for years and generations across multiple cultures and communities that we've never deemed as sexual and domestic violence prevention. But now we're fully starting to recognize if we want to live into our principles of anti-oppression and intersectionality, we have to be the ones who are starting to uplift that work that's truly happening.
Yeah, I think for us, it's been conversations on, if these are our values, how are we living our values? How is that actually showing up? How is this not just lip service? How are these not just words on a slide? Because Joseph is right, prevention work is happening all around us. It's happening every day in communities where you are. But a lot of us have been so conditioned to view it based in, is it in a toolkit? Is it in a technical package, that we miss the work being done in communities? And every day people are working to change norms and values in their communities. And they might not be doing it in a box curricular way, but that does not make the work less valuable. That does not mean that we shouldn't be highlighting and really focusing. In fact, we must be doing that, because it's all of our goals to grow the amount of prevention work. And for so long, including right now, academic language has been used to gatekeep funding and resources from communities who need it the most. And we don't want to be furthering that type of harmful practice. And so a lot of the questions that we have, that we ask each other all the time is this reflective of our values? How are we living these values? How are they showing up in the work that we're doing? And if we can't answer that, then we have to stop doing it. And I think when we think about how are we actually transforming field language, well, sometimes the process of that is a little bit messy, and we're in the middle of transforming our work in Michigan right now. And so, Joseph and I are really going to be vulnerable and transparent about some recent meetings that we've had with folks across the state, and saying, we have to do something different. This is not working.
Yes, absolutely. Amanda, thank you for bringing in the fact that we are still also learning. We are still trying to figure this all out, because our movement, our organization has been so steeped in the field jargon for so long, right? And so what we have here, so for 15 plus years, we had this like virtual learning space where people were to come weekly to talk about something prevention related or something around how to better serve survivors, right? It was always lecture based, and you had to read academic articles or watch fancy videos and lectures, and we had to unpack it, and then how do you practically apply it to your work? For 15 years, up until literally this summer, we recognized that hasn't been working. Like, no one is excited to come to these spaces. Me and Amanda and other staff who train in those spaces aren't necessarily looking forward to having to talk about like what exactly the socio-ecological model is, or the difference between primary, secondary, tertiary prevention is, or like what are social determinants of health. Like, those are things that, yes, it's important when you're applying for a grant, but when it comes down to it, no one's going to necessarily care that fits in your community level program and policy effort. No one's going to care that, oh, the work that I'm doing builds social cohesion and community connectedness. Like, those are terms that we spent weeks and months training folks on to learn about, and then we expect them to practically apply it. But like there's such a vast disconnect in our goals. How can we really build stronger communities when we are providing jargon and gatekeeping what counts as prevention? We know for so long cultures and communities have been building spaces that is cohesive and that thrives on bringing people together, and that didn't require evidence-informed toolkits from the CDC to justify it. And so I think, so for this is a new space that we have just rebranded. It used to be called the Activism Conservatory, right? A virtual learning space that we've had for like 15 years. And we literally just this summer has renamed it to Community as Prevention, right? Like, how can we then make it a space that means something to people, that really works towards our goals of preventing violence in a way that can be resonant to everybody?
Yeah, and I think when we think of the language piece, we are always asking ourselves, is it necessary to use certain language? Then why? So sometimes it will be yes, but really, why is it necessary to use that language? Do we have to say those jargon words? Isn't the point of prevention work to grow the amount of work happening? And if people cannot see themselves in the work because of the language, then why do we continue to use it? Why are we constantly regurgitating language that isn't resonant to communities and not uplifting the community-based language and words that are being used? And as we work at a state coalition, and so we are uniquely positioned to be able to work at multiple different levels and have these conversations and say, I am not unaware that sometimes this language is required for funding, but why? And so can we leverage some of the privilege that we have in spaces and saying, I know that this is on an application, but why? What are you actually asking? What do you actually want to happen? Because if it's to prevent violence, people are doing that. People have been doing that in communities and you're not seeing it. And sometimes it's saying that to people who make decisions like that so that we can continue to uplift the work that we are seeing in community.
Absolutely, right? Like, I just want to bring up another example that we've recently done is a couple of weeks ago, we held our Creating Safer Neighborhoods gathering, which for years, it used to be called like our Activism Conservatory Prevention Summit. Right, like 4 words that means nothing to anybody. What is a conservatory besides a room and clue, right? Like, or like where you like water plants, or perhaps where like flute majors go to study, right? Like, what is that? And what's a prevention summit? Like what are those things, right? And so we finally, like, we wanted to restructure and revamp and completely just throw away the old model and our way of thinking of how prevention is supposed to work. And all we did in this 2-day conference was provide a space for folks who are doing community building work, on the ground, grassroots work, a space to share how the awesome things that they're doing is changing their communities in Michigan. And that was something that we really want to do moving forward. If we actually want to live into our anti-oppression values, we can't be the ones who get to decide what counts and what doesn't. We don't get to be the ones, just because we have a fancy grant from the CDC, that gets to deem what is allowable and what actually brings people together.
I think for us, this slide represents some of our own internal processes that we have been really leaning into the last 6 months. And our team has had to be really transparent with people we've been working with. Like Joseph and I said, we were on a meeting and we were like, we have to stop right now because this is not working. And we don't know exactly what it's going to look like next week, but we know it can't look like this anymore, because we inherited a structure that was harmful. And so a lot of you might have inherited a structure that just doesn't make sense. And so we want to give you permission that it's okay to engage in this like really beautiful and messy process to dismantle that structure and uproot some things that just aren't working. We don't have all of the answers. And we've had to say that to people. We don't have the answers. And if we really want to build community, we know that we have to be honest. We have to keep showing up in spaces and keep trying, even if we fail, and just show up again and do better the next time.
Absolutely, Amanda, right? Because if we actually want to live into what we preach about and what we expect others to do, which is to center anti-oppression, but yet we continue to replicate it and uphold it in all the work that we do, that we pretend we're like the shining beacon of all prevention work in the world, like how is that not white supremacist at its core, right? And those are things that we are really trying to be intentional to in dismantling and being vulnerable, owning what we know and don't know, and being consistent throughout and being really authentic throughout that process. And that we can't just be worshiping the written word and striving for perfection, because at the end of the day, we can't be doing those things and then saying that we want to dismantle oppression. Like that just will never, ever be cohesive.
And we could talk about this all of the time, and we are more than happy to talk with you all about uprooting some of your practices that no longer work. So please reach out to us. Come to our meetings every other Tuesday if you'd like to really lean into some of these conversations. We're so excited to get to share space with you, and we're all looking for like, how do we actually transform the field and some of the language being used, because what we know is it's not working.
Thank you so much, Amanda and Joseph. I really hear, and I love all the work that you've done with what used to be the conservatory, and recognizing that what we call prevention in those toolkits is not always what's happening. So I'd love to hear from you. Let's just like name them. Let's throw them out. I think that's a good way to kind of frame the conversations. What are some of the real prevention efforts that aren't always recognized in like out of the box or just in the box prevention?
Yeah, absolutely. So for some examples that come to mind that when we invited folks to our summit a couple of weeks ago, we had somebody who was able to talk about how they provide free childcare to survivors, right? When we know that economic justice and financial just autonomy is a way in which we can help prevent violence. That was one thing that they did that is not at all RPE funded or Delta funded or state funded. We had someone speak about how their literacy programs for youth, talking about healthy relationships for LGBTQ youth or immigrant youth, and all those different things. We had folks talk about really even just how do they make safe, welcoming spaces for children at a child advocacy center, right? Like those are things that we don't think about as prevention, but at its core, we know we have to physically modify environments so people can feel connected, right? Like if we're translating CDC jargon and language into what's actually happening, people are already doing that, but we don't deem any of those spaces as prevention. And so there's so many other spaces that we can go on and on about, but it's really going into your community, identifying what's already happening, and then using that to fit into the field jargon versus the vice versa, the alternate way in which we've been doing it this whole time. We should be going bottom up, not top down.
Absolutely. And we hear all the time from culturally specific organizations and people who are doing more traditional work that work is preventing violence. It's creating communities. We had a speaker at our recent event talking about having people have access to their own traditional medicines and being able to do that work, and how that is healing and preventative. And at the same time, you know, Joseph and I are on a lot of national calls where people are talking about innovative, like the newest ways to do prevention. And it's really hard for communities, really specifically communities of color who've been doing this since forever, to say, so now that it's in a toolkit, you see this as valid, but we've actually experienced violence for doing this by dominant culture before. And so being really careful that kind of stuff is happening and it's harming people. So like that has always happened for communities, and that work has never really been seen or valued as prevention work, but it's not new and it's always been happening.
Thank you both so much. That's so powerful too. And thank you for bringing in the impact of dominant culture. I'm seeing some really cool answers in the chat too. I'm seeing community gardens, housing justice, childcare, living wages. Absolutely. Thank you all for bringing those in. Access to traditional spiritual practices, anti-racism, 100%. And I think this really transitions us well into the work that's happening at the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So Solomon, I'm really excited to have you here and to talk about the different ways that you all are bringing community along and collaborating in prevention.
Thank you so much, Janae. Thank you, Michigan. I just feeling all the love. I also loved that I was invited to send a photo that was not traditional. So that is me with my cat, Cynthia. But yeah, so I really want to start today by telling a story. So I work in prevention, as Janae said, at the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And the reason I find this topic so compelling is that I came to prevention from one of those routes, actually, that came up in the chat. I was watching. I was in a cross-secting field doing community-based nonprofit work with food insecurity and food justice. So I was not thinking of my work as prevention, that is for sure. And I had the opportunity to be trained by some of our current coalition members, the first one with Colleen Yackel, and we did an activity called chili cheese fries that maybe some of you have done before. And it was such a joyful invitation into the world of prevention, into the world of the social ecology without using the word social ecological model. So I've learned over time that public health, it's abstract, it's complicated, and even when it doesn't mean to, like we've been talking about, it leaves folks out of the conversations. But when the coalition really started turning the framework into metaphors, into engaging activities, that for me in chili cheese fries and a few other activities, it really made me fall head over heels for public health. or at least for the way that I was learning about public health and violence prevention. And I ended up getting my MPH. So I learned that all of us who are building community, as we were talking about, are doing a kind of prevention work, and that when I was growing winter gardens and teaching about canning and fermentation, that folks were getting connected to each other, getting connected to the organization, getting connected to the community, and that connectedness meant that prevention work was happening without any of the language being used. So I eventually transitioned into prevention work, and I haven't turned back because of spaces like this, honestly. So at ICADV, we know that inviting language makes prevention strategies welcome spaces for folks to craft the safety and stability that they want and need, not defined by us as a coalition or by the public health community, but by folks on the ground living their lives. I'd like to share the coalition's story of play, joy, and listening that has enabled on the ground change. So I'm going to start with the toy box. And I brought up Colleen Yackel, and she and some of our former staff members pulled together this toy box with games that use interactive activities that make public health theories approachable without necessarily using the terminology, but instead using metaphors and activities that folks could apply to their own lives. The first activity that I went through was called Natty Spaghetti, and it lit my brain up with this fascination about the way that social issues are interconnected. And it was really my entry into understanding the power of collective action. Other games help participants move from individual to structural solutions. That can lead to some defensiveness when we've been really grounded in individual level work. But when you turn it into a game about mouse helmets, it makes it a lot more approachable. Also, games that talk about considering intentional design that meet varied needs, allow for data collection, and all of it, again, without necessarily needing to use the language. And so we'll share with you that toy box and are available to discuss that more as we move forward. So the next part of this journey that we're on is the treasure map. So another one of my incredible colleagues at the coalition, Sierra Olivia Thomas Williams, was working with a former iteration of our youth council, and they used an activity from the toy box called What Surrounds Us Shapes Us. And they went around using that activity, again, not using the CDC framework, but just the language of safety, stability, and nurturing, and collected information from discussion, from drawing, from writing, and we're able to figure out what is it that makes young people in Indiana feel a sense of safety, stability, and nurturing. And the language that came up, we can associate it with a lot of those words that showed up in our word cloud. But it's everything from stable basics to acceptance and inclusion that young people named. And the way that we were able to share it back. And I wasn't around at this time, so I'm just like, gushed out and was at that point by the way that it came out, was this beautiful map that I at the time had up in my office because it was a really accessible and creative way of sharing back what was important to young people in Indiana. So that takes us on our next step of the journey, which is our current youth council, which I've had such a great honor of working with this group of teens and just amazing humans from across the state. And really, we strive and came into our youth council knowing we wanted to move power to our youth members by moving resources to young people and facilitating access to adult gatekeepers, adults with power, and systems that impact conditions. So we pay the young people on the youth council for their time and expertise. We build an environment where they define the conditions that they need for safety, and their activities within and beyond the council enable them to shift conditions in their schools and communities. And I'll give some examples of this as we move on, knowing that we're hearing from a lot more amazing folks. So the example that I wanted to take us to next, I think there are probably a lot of you who in the spaces where you have humans working together and trying to figure out how to communicate, come up with solutions and change the world, use some form of working agreements. At the ICADV Youth Council, the young people have co-created these working agreements, and they're alive. They change. Even a couple of them changed at our most recent meeting. But a couple of them I thought really lifted up what we're talking about today. So one of them being to break it down. So we are all accountable when we're using language to being intentional, that we're using language that other folks know, but we don't do that all the time. So we're also always working on saying, so what was that acronym? What did you mean by this word? And it's a great way for us to connect across the fact that we're, I'm saying that they are coming from different contexts and using different language. Another one is saying it messy. And I actually think this is an incredible tool. Being able to go into a space and say what you're feeling and how it comes naturally, and not feeling like it needs to be a written out speech that you might write in school. And instead working through it, and then maybe getting feedback and having some folks say, ooh, and use another one, our oops and ouch, where we have an opportunity to look at how language is impacting one another. I'm saying we because I get to spend time with them, which is delightful. So what that has ended up looking like is that there have been meetings where young people have learned about how our state legislature works. They've practiced talking to folks from state level agencies about how they would like to see them interact with young people. They've practiced talking to people with power in their own communities and in their own school climates. And in one case, really advocating for, hey, all this stuff is happening at the state level. Can we learn about this in school and write about it and talk about how it's impacting us? So there's been this ripple effect of our members, the work that they're doing internally, but also externally, and it's defined by them. So we could go ahead and put it into that public health approach language, but it's not necessary in order for the work to be done. So I wanna give a lot of space for the rest of the coalitions who are going to be speaking today, but I also want to make sure to share some information. I want to co-create with those of you that were moved. And so here is our information, my information, and looking forward to see the next level of this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Solomon. That is always so incredible to hear you speak. I'd love to hear, and maybe for the sake of time, just like one lesson. You shared a lot about the work that you do with youth. What have you learned, especially around language, from the youth that you work with, and how has that shaped the way that ICADV does things?
Yeah, so much. I would say the most important one when I was thinking through it was that often, because we all have access and proximity to young people in different ways, and can make assumptions about what language they want to use. And so my examples are that I was like, they're not going to want to use youth council. That's so like rigid and boring. Like, what is the name that feels good to you all? And they were like, no, we're a youth council. Council feels good. It makes us feel powerful. And so making sure that my assumptions are not getting in the way of their ability to define their own work. Also, we have a lot of LGBTQ plus young people that are on our council. And again, that not making the assumption that language that is used at one meeting is going to be the right language for the next one, or that my proximity to that language in other spaces is going to translate. And so that, I think, has been really useful for us as a coalition, because it applies to every group of humans that we're working from and that we want to center in terms of coming up with strategies and solutions for ending violence. I could keep going, but I will not.
No, thank you. I love that. And, thinking about the assumptions that we have and that we make. And I was thinking about, well, what do you do to not have those assumptions? Well, you ask the people, you have the relationships, but if you don't have the relationship, then you're going to make assumptions. So that is like oftentimes the first place. And I think that leads us really well into our next two sets of speakers, because they both are talking a lot about relationship building. So I'll pass it off to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment now, to Danielle and Ray, to hear about the work that you're doing to build relationships, to cut out some of this jargon in your state.
Thanks, Janae. Just real quick, wanted to correct, Danielle is with Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And while I'm sure I would love to be a part of rooting movements, I am part of University of Colorado School of Medicine Emergency Medicine Department.
So sorry about that.
No, not at all. And for pronouns, I'm good. I'm trying to get people to get my name correct. That's why I go by Ray. We're working on it, right?
Sorry.
So, no, not at all. Things happen, right? Unless Danielle is transferred in the last week, and this is a surprise to me. So we're going to talk a little bit about a new process, much like I heard Joseph say earlier, throwing away the old. And you're going to hear that a lot, I think, throughout this webinar, and talking about really giving the mic to the people. And I love this slide because it really makes me think this is a lot of the time how we go about our community engagement process. We say, oh, we would love to talk to the community. And then we offer them this rickety old table, which is not really welcoming. It's not necessarily sturdy or stable. And you can run with the metaphors on that there. And when historically community engagement feels like this, we really have to acknowledge that there's new ways to engage and partner with community. It's necessary. There's a great quote from Audre Lorde that says, without community, there is no liberation. And so what we learned in this work, all of us here, but really kind of the world at large in these pandemic years, that we really have to center equity priorities in any work that has to do with sexual violence prevention strategies, because we're not going to be able to address the elimination of sexual violence or any violence truly without eliminating oppression. And in order to even begin that, we had to recognize this. Where a lot of federally funded programs have typically been conducted in a top-down or a dictation to community, the research tells us what communities impacted from top-down government programs already know, that this has caused generations of harm and created a really understandable distrust of government help. And in seeking to reconcile, and repair these harms and move forward into actionable work that's truly in service of the people and communities we work to serve, we're making shifts in the ways that power is held or withheld, and which voices are heard or silenced, and needs are met or ignored. Yes, that table does not look safe at all. I love this quote. It's from a researcher and evaluator in the Native American community named Grandmother Strong Oak, and basically goes forward to say the original Constitution says that only white male property owners could own land, and only they could vote, and only they had the money with which to own the land. All life forms became objectified in that momentous decision without their consent, and that is the first violence. We see sexual and domestic violence everywhere. Histories need to be told to heal our pain. No harm can be addressed effectively without that critical understanding. That sounds incredible, and again, heavy language. I'm just going to say, without dissecting the facets of violence in any form, it can't be ignored that at its inception, violence is born from the idea that one person's life or body is deemed less valuable than another, that I'm worth more than you, and because of that, I hold the power, you don't, and that entitles me to do what I feel like, and I owe you zero regard or humanity. And when you think about it, all forms of oppression are really predicated on this, whether that is sexism, ableism, classism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia, religiosity, nationalism, and the one that is most visible at first glance, of course, is racism. And so with that in mind, Danielle and I spent a lot of time getting ready for the next 5-year RPE grant that's going to be coming out, and really, like we'd said repeatedly, really wanting to throw away the old way and the application that came with it. So we spent much of the last year really thinking about how to do this. And so this visual here is kind of a diagram of a 3-pronged approach that we were doing. The top track in the turquoise is in community. The middle track in purple is an advisory team. And the fuchsia, if you will, is internal to not only our program, but partner state agencies. What we did to start was hire a third-party consultant who's also really a community wisdom keeper. And their work was to get input and narratives of lived experiences that would inform how we structured our violence prevention. The purple being the advisory team was a very specifically recruited group of community consultants holding multiple and intersectional identities that aligned with the priorities of our grant program in Colorado. So that being Black, Latina, Native American, non-conventional sexual orientation, gender identity, youth, urban and rural were present. And unintentionally, there was an unfortunate shared experience of experiencing sexual violence, whether it was through ourselves or someone very close to the advisors. And they still remain contracted as subject matter experts throughout the rest of this project and into the next grant cycle, but they'll be reviewing the applications and also providing some sort of a cultural sensitivity training in TA, responsiveness or consulting for the new grantees. And then lastly, this berry color is internal to our program. So that at the time was Danielle, myself, and our evaluator, Lillian, but also partners who were current grantees, non-funded partners, any other program stakeholders. And the way we did this to have those 3 tracks running at the same time is really just because power imbalances exist. And in the request for applications now, for example, right off the jump, it says, in seeking to advance equity and focus violence prevention actions where the burden is most, we seek to identify and partner with organizations who amplify the voice of our priority communities. So right away, we wanted to make sure that people understood the assignment. This is what we want to do with this grant. And if that doesn't resonate, that is okay, but this just might not be the place for you. You know how there's such a thing as not all money is good money, right? So this approach also really had to focus on making all of our public health language more accessible and digestible. And doing that, we could then expand where those entry points for the work in upstream violence prevention were, and lay down the connecting language or kind of the cheat codes for doing intentional outreach to recruit new partners and grantees who maybe typically haven't applied in the past. And even though, honestly, that comes with the best intentionality, it's still a really big mouthful of marbles. And outside of a lot of the public health or system spaces, it still doesn't quite make sense. Much like, I love the movie Rush Hour. Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? Like Janae had said too, I came to this work more through lived experience. Unfortunately, sometimes that comes through survivorship for many of us, and not necessarily a public health background. And so if you're like me in this, you know the language is really just nonstop speed bumps down this path. I spent a really long time feeling lost and honestly kind of stupid or intellectually inadequate when I first took up this role. And that distracted me because I felt lost, or I felt behind the curve, or I was questioning my own intelligence, or I was grabbing a dictionary to check things. So like in the word cloud, we all know we have a lot of very expensive words in our field. And that really does all of us a disservice because it's going to create some misunderstandings and maybe some distrust. So for example, if I say, the history of American violence is upheld in the cultural pillars of Eurocentric colonizer norms of enslavement, expunction, and kleptocracy, where did you start to tune me out? Or get tripped up with the weird word you never heard before? I love the word kleptocracy. Or were you just bored? And that's okay too. And that's a lot of how we come across to communities, because at some points we might as well just be speaking another language. And that's on us to address. It's not on the community members to learn a new language in order to interact with us. So for example, what this looks like, we learned a lot in our first round of those community conversations. And a lot of it was just that our field language is massively confusing to others. So in this example, this is more of just a rephrased version of the same old public health concept. Instead of identify problem, identify root causes, identify risk and protective factors, identify levers and strategies, collect outcome data. We reworded this. Now, I kind of have an on-demand resource of a in-house teenager, but all of you have a friend, a family member, someone who's not in this field, and check in with yourself and see, do they really understand what you're saying when you're trying to explain or share about your work? Or do they come with more questions than comprehension? And kind of as a check for understanding with my kid, I'll say, what would you tell somebody else about this? Or how would you tell another person about this over dinner? Because if the gist of it isn't there, that's an L on the teacher, not the student, right? So with that in mind, Danielle's going to elaborate a little bit more on what the social and commercial determinants of health and all those potential entry points can look like with reframed work and making language that resonates with community as far as what primary prevention looks like to organizations who are already doing that on the ground.
Hi all, I'm going to keep it a bit shorter because I want to make sure that New Jersey has plenty of time to present. I'm excited to listen to them too. But a couple things I think worth noting. So when we started working with our community partners, one of the conversations we had candidly with them was, we know that we need to really unpack our language, make it more accessible, use the language that community uses. And we know that a lot of these pieces of language and concepts and jargon and approaches also are going to continue to show up in spaces where organizations and communities need to access funding. And so how do we find this balance where we create space to really integrate the words that are being used in community while also connecting that back to some of the core concepts that a lot of funders use that may not be immediate. One of the things.
Okay. All right. Thank you all. Sorry. Thank you for your patience. Well, I think one thing that I really appreciate so much about your story in Colorado is that you are newer to this work, right? Like so often on web conferences, we bring experts, you are still an expert, but experts in who have been doing this for a long time. So it can really feel hard for people to see themselves in switching to do things differently. So I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the bigger challenges to building that better table for community to come to, especially since it's probably a little bit more fresh in your minds?
I think obviously we spoke about like the first challenge is just how do we say what we need to in ways that are going to be easy to understand and inspiring to move the work forward rather than getting stuck in a word search or a dictionary hunt into the language. But what we really did intentionally was bringing in a third-party advisor for the community conversations as well as the advisory team, and name that in order for this to work, in order for it to be fully community driven and informed, including what we were going to do internally, we had to have a seat and we had to listen and we had to ask questions to listen and gain more information and understanding. Because I think at the end of the day, even though we have our assignments, we have our job titles, we're all humans. And we're imperfect and we're wounded and we're evolving and we're thriving. And some people, despite all of the historic atrocities that their community has survived, have more information as to what survivorship and violence prevention can really look like. And honestly, it just meant taking a big pill of humility and saying, while we are the government, we don't know everything. And in order for you to have a conversation with us, we have to acknowledge the harms that have been done. We have to acknowledge that you don't need saving and that it's maybe been centuries that systems have ignored this community. And what do we need to do to repair that? And why do we care now?
Thank you so much. That makes so much sense and is so real of you to share. I appreciate that. And I also love a good meme. So I love all the memes in your presentation. So then the next piece, we're going to pass it over to people who I would say are some real experts in building that relationship. They were the first guests that I brought onto a PreventConnect web conference, and that's the New Jersey Engaging Men and Boys Project. So I will pass it over to Ariana and Will to tell us a little bit about the work that they do and how they got there.
Hi, everyone. I guess I'll start it off. So I'm Ariana Cohen from New Jersey Department of Children and Families, Division on Women, and I am the RPE program specialist here for New Jersey. So I think the importance of the Engaging Men and Boys piece was one, that we had to have a solid funder and sub-grantee relationship, and we decided to go with New Jersey Coalition to End Domestic Violence. I think the question is, well, why didn't we do the SB Coalition? But our thought was, one, we wanted to leverage what was already going on in New Jersey. And Will had this amazing group called the Men of Courage, which he'll tell a little bit more about. But there was already men who were engaged in gender-based violence prevention, who was already doing the work, who was involved and who was already committed. So it makes sense to partner with someone who is from New Jersey doing the work in order for us to take on this new initiative. RPE changed from focusing on just trying to change folks' knowledge, attitude, and behaviors into more of that public health approach, that community level, which really just means transforming communities. And if you're asking folks to transform communities who you've never had a relationship with, and you are a funder at the state level and in state government, one, they're not going to have that community trust with you. And we needed a partner who already had that community trust. And also, we knew that we didn't just want this to be a funded initiative. We wanted to make sure that it was a movement and that it was sustainable. So we needed to build partnership with the community in a way that was, I'm going to say, mutual beneficial. It wasn't just about coming in and taking and taking and taking, but this balance of receiving and giving information. So that all started when we decided to go on a statewide, we set out to do a statewide community conversation. At first, we wanted to call it a focus group or a listening session, but the community told us that you're not going to come in our communities and basically test us and then just leave us with nothing. So in order for us to create, once again, that building that trust, we had to call community conversations, because this wasn't a one-way talk. It was us listening to them, but giving them information as well too. And we met those communities where they were. We didn't tell them to come to the capital of New Jersey and Trenton to have a conversation with us. We went into their communities wherever it was. And as we are engaging men and boys, if that meant that we had to go into a barbershop to have these conversations, guess where New Jersey went? We went into the barbershop to have those conversations, because that's where they felt safe. Especially when we're thinking about men, that's more of a therapeutic space for them. So if we really wanted to know some things that they wanted to change or see change, we needed to be where they were. So some of the things that came out of that conversation is, one, that young boys and men were not equipped with understanding the word consent. Yes, they knew the legal definition, and that was about it. And then also what came out of those conversations is that men wanted to change the narrative of how they were seen within communities, especially our Black and brown men. They no longer wanted to be seen as perpetrators. They wanted to be seen as allies. And that's something that we took a hold of, and we knew that if they want to be seen differently, then their voices matter, and they are going to be valued for their voices and their positions within communities. And they're going to carry this work through. Will, do you want to jump in? Because I don't want to take up so much space and so much time. If
Yeah,
you just
Ariana,
want to talk about the relationships of building it with our community liaisons.
thank you so much. I really enjoyed the three previous coalitions that went before us. Thank you so much for your truth that was shared. It really stoked my fire to get me to this place right now where I'm at, and I feel privileged to have the opportunity to kind of wrap it up. I know we opened up the slides, and I just been kind of making notes. We'd opened up this presentation talking about what was the aim of really being in the community and what that looked like. And it was many folks in the Menti responses put like support, respect, connections, understanding, transparency, and I just really put the word relatable, because that was just a kind of like a summation of all of those different words. And so if the goal is to really do that and really to be relatable to communities, we have to know how to relate to communities, and we have to I'm even going to be unapologetic about saying we have to want to be relatable to communities. And you can't teach somebody how to want to be in their communities. There has to be a passion that is inherent inside of you, and that you really want to feel connected, and you desire that connection to be relatable to your communities. And so really the goal, the goals of this is two-pronged. Honestly, when we talk about this, yes, I'm engaging men and boys, but we're also, as many of my other panelists have also mentioned, that we're doing prevention on two, on multiple levels. But really what I'm hearing consistently with what we believe as well too is that we're preventing the influence of white supremacy tenets, and then we're also preventing the disconnect between systems and communities. And so we have to look at prevention, outside of the box, and not just, what our funders tell us that, we need to have around our deliverables, because often the deliverables are, very nice words that look great on paper, and they make for great reports to submit to other funders and other folks who read reports and those behind the scenes. And no shade on those folks, but carrying it out on the streets and really where the way that looks is very different, because it doesn't translate into our communities. Our communities are not familiar, and I don't want to be redundant to some of what the other panelists have said, but it's just the truth. We use words that are unfamiliar. We use language that is unfamiliar, and really what that stems from a mindset that we have about how the work needs to get done. And really where the work needs to be translated is that paradigm shift of just our thought process that will give us a different action and a different behavior. And so for us as the coalition, it's very important for me to highlight that our social change plan is the driving force behind everything we do. And it's a three-pronged approach of healing practices, social justice, and connection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and I'm going to meld that into what I'm going to talk about with the engaging men and boys work, and really the way that looks. And so healing practices and social justice and connection, how that fits into our work is that it's looking at individuals, looking at communities as full people. And so when we talk about this, what we did is, I've been hearing this terminology of saying from the bottom up, and what we want to do is we want to give communities their voice. So what we've done with our work is we've partnered with 5 men who were what I'll say is who are movers and shakers in their communities, who have their thumb on the pulse of their communities, and we've partnered with them. But we didn't go in the way and do work with the ways systems traditionally do work. We went in and said, we're not going to pillage your time, talents, and abilities. We're going to pay you for your time, talents, and abilities, and we're going to partner with you under contract and say, we are going to give you a substantial amount of money to do this work. And the beauty of it is that they've already been doing the work, and this just gave them an opportunity to dream. It gave them opportunity to really enhance the way that their work, some of the projects and things that they've been doing. And then furthermore, they're strategically placed throughout our state, because for all my New Jerseyans, I'm sure you'll give me a high five on this one. New Jerseyans like to stay in their communities, so folks don't like to transition out. So if we had one hub, like in a particular location, the work wouldn't have been successful. So we partnered with 5 men who who are scattered across our state, that make sure that we give coverage to the work that we're doing in their respective communities. But the power of this project is really the voices and the unconventional ways. One of the other panelists is talking about how systems will take work that communities have been doing for years and say and adopt it and say it's innovative. Well, they've been innovating for years, and we just haven't had the wherewithal to go into communities and really listen to the communities, listen to the leaders, and hear from them how the work should be done. We have instead showed up and told communities what they should be doing. It's kind of a shame that I don't have much time to continue on, so I'm kind of really abbreviating. But I really want to say that this discussion today is of the utmost importance. When we talk about doing the work, we brought in some of the work that we've done. We brought in national organizations. One particular national organization, A Call to Men, really helped us see that either we're getting in the way of the work, or we need to get out of the way of the work. I should say, we're in the way, or we need to find our way to be helpful. So we're either being helpful or we're being harmful. And it's really eye-opening, because for some individuals who sat in those trainings, it's, you're 15, 20 years in the work, some people 8, 9 years, 10 years in the work. And, you feel like you're at a place where you kind of understand. But the reality is that a lot of us were taught to do the work in a way that's not effective. It's not productive. And at the end of the day, it's not relatable. In a lot of senses, communities are being harmed because what funded initiatives do is they go into communities and pump in a lot of money. But then when the money dries up, they leave the community stale and dry with no opportunities having ever built anything for sustainability. So we want to move away from that. The work that we're doing, as Ariana said, this is a movement. This is not a funded initiative. The funded initiative, well, I'll say lit the fire, but it's up to us to help cultivate the community, to fan the flame, to keep it burning. So I'll stop there. I have so much more to say, but for the sake of time, I'll kick it back to Janae.
Thanks, Will. And if you are listening to what Will is sharing and you're wanting to hear more, we have a web conference that Will did with some of their community liaisons that they talked about. That's at PreventConnect.org. I think if you search community engagement, that should show up. I think it was the second in a 2-part series, if you're interested. So I would love to hear from you. We have 2 questions for you, but I think for time, I'm going to bring it down to 1, because I saw something similar in the chat earlier today. And that's, someone's in a position, let's say, where they are wanting to move away from the box definitions and they're feeling like their community is calling for something, but they're not in a place where they can ask their funder for change, right? Like there's a power dynamic there. And I know, Ariana and Will, you've been really intentional as a funder and a sub-grantee in creating pathways for that feedback. Can you, briefly share about how you built that collaborative relationship and how that kind of creates those pathways?
Ariana, you want to go or you want me to go?
Well, you can take this one.
Okay. So for me, it starts out with relationship. I'm big on, I read this book called The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, and I don't make any money off of selling it, but it's it's one of the books, and it talks about taking a heart before you take a hand. And really, that's really where it lies with us, is that we're heart connected. We're heart connected, and what I mean by that is that we're both passionate. We're all three of us are passionate about the work that we do. I'd be remiss without giving a shout out to our partner, Danielle Scott, who is an equally important part in this whole work. So really, the relationship is very important, but it started out there. We're all three of us are very active in our communities, and we're very passionate about our communities, and so that relationship was just very organic, and so it wasn't your typical being scared to talk to your funder relationship. It was invited. Like, I looked forward to conversations with them. We became a team, and we started really talking through and talking about, and we had some starts and stops and redirects, but we did it together, and we figured out things, and we worked together. And as we did that, we bonded and we grew, and we began to really talk about some of the challenges that we faced individually that we knew other folks in communities were facing. And so it just brought a tight bond together that I would honestly say, if it was to be able to be captured in sort of some documentary or some film, that it's a beautiful dance between the three of us of just how to really work together. You shouldn't be scared of your funder. You should be able to talk with your funder. And they gave me the opportunity to push back when we talk about reporting. So reporting is a dirty word in our work, where it's very structured, it's very rigid, and it only collects certain information. And I knew that if this project was going to be successful, that it couldn't look any way traditional. It had to be something that was authentic. So within reason, I was able to push back, and they met me where I was at, and we were able to create reporting that is reflective of capturing information that is important to really give you the depth of how impactful the work that we're doing is. Again, I could say so much more, but I want to be respectful of time. But I would just say this, that I'm grateful for the opportunity. I know some folks on this call don't necessarily have that opportunity to have that relationship with your funders, but I would say if you are a funder on this call and you are a sub-grantee, I would say that, develop your relationship, develop the rapport with them, and funders, give your sub-grantees opportunities to really fly as high as they can, because it's only going to be beneficial to you when you're submitting how effective the project was.
Thank you so much, Will and Ariana. And thank you everyone for attending this web conference. Just a reminder that we still have 2 more sessions, one next week, one the week following. So you can register for those at PreventConnect.org. And we would love, as you're leaving, if you want to put in the chat any thoughts that you have, or maybe one action you could take to create lines of shared power in prevention language. We really appreciate everyone. Thank you so much. And we will be sending out an evaluation and a recording of this web conference very shortly.